Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to be speaking to you today about the rotavirus vaccine rollout. And this is a story that is still being told. Rotavirus, as we know, is one of the commonest causes of acute watery diarrhea in young children. And this figure is taken from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, which shows us that diarrhea continues to be a major killer among children under 5, even today. If we look at the latest figures, we have a rate of about 9.7% of all deaths that occur in children who are less than 5 years of age being attributed to diarrhea. And among all the diarrheal deaths, approximately somewhere between 40 and 60% of them are due to rotavirus gastroenteritis. Now, we would have expected that this number would have declined substantially with the introduction of rotavirus vaccines. That has begun to happen, but the changes by just vaccination are only just being computed. Now, if we look at rotavirus and when it causes diarrhea, if we look at under 5 years of age, most of the rotavirus gastroenteritis that is seen in low and middle income countries is seen in the first 12 months of life in infancy. There is a certain proportion in 12 to 23 months. And in the rest of the world, you tend to see a later onset of rotavirus gastroenteritis. These are data from a study that compared what was happening with moderate to severe diarrhea in children under 5 in 7 countries in Asia and Africa. And they used the best available tools and a case control design and demonstrated that rotavirus was the commonest cause of moderate to severe diarrhea in infancy. As you can see, rotavirus diarrhea was causing more than double the diarrhea as compared to any other pathogen that was seen in children. Now, when we look at rotavirus vaccines, this map looks largely green, but there are some countries that are shown in yellow that have very large populations, which have not yet been reached by rotavirus vaccination. And several other countries have introduced the vaccine relatively recently, and that has meant that the impact of rotavirus vaccines has only begun to emerge for low and middle income countries. And in Asia specifically, the data on real world effectiveness of rotavirus vaccines is still lacking in most countries. Now, we have 4 WHO pre-qualified vaccines. 2 of these were WHO pre-qualified in 2006. And these are the vaccines Rotarix and Rotatec that are made by GSK and Merck. These vaccines were WHO pre-qualified pretty quickly, but the amount of vaccine that was available through the pre-qualification mechanism for countries that were supported by Gavi was relatively limited. And the fact that these vaccines outside of the Gavi supply were quite highly priced meant that many middle-income countries and many low-income countries had not introduced the rotavirus vaccination until recently. Rotavac and Rotacil are 2 vaccines that are made by Indian vaccine companies, Bharat Biotech and Serum Institute of India. These became WHO pre-qualified in 2018. And since their pre-qualification, some countries have begun to introduce vaccine, and other countries that were using the Rotacil and the Rotarix and the Rotatec vaccines have begun to make a switch because there is greater supply available of these vaccines, and they are also more cheaply priced. The current price for rotavirus vaccines in India is less than 60 cents a dose of the vaccine. Now, if we compare all the rotavirus vaccines that are available, GSK, Merck, the Bharat Biotech vaccine, the Serum Institute vaccine, these are the 4 pre-qualified vaccines. And then we have 2 locally licensed vaccines in countries that have introduced or are introducing vaccines countrywide. Polyvac in Vietnam makes Rotavin, which is very similar to the GSK product. And then in China, you have the Lanzhou vaccine, which is an animal vaccine, animal rotavirus derived vaccine from lamb rotavirus. And Merck is also setting up a facility in China to make vaccines for the Chinese market. There is the original rotavirus vaccine, the first one to be licensed in 1998, which is RotaShield. The license for that vaccine is still in existence, but the vaccine is really not being manufactured or used because it was withdrawn by the company originally because of the association that was seen with intussusception. Therefore, when these vaccines are used across the world, there are 2 things that are measured. One is what is the real world impact of these vaccines? Do they reduce diarrhea? Do they reduce rotavirus diarrhea? Do they reduce hospitalizations and death due to rotavirus? And the second is to look at safety of these vaccines to see whether there is an association of the vaccine with intussusception or not. So far, wherever studies have been done, the results have been relatively consistent, except in the case of intussusception. Now, when we look at vaccine efficacy data, a pattern emerges from the phase 3 clinical trials, which has required validation of the findings when the vaccines have been brought into low and middle income countries. And that pattern is to show that there is a high level of efficacy that is seen in high income countries. And then as you go to middle and low income countries, the vaccine efficacy declines. Now, this is not unusual. This is a pattern that has been seen previously with oral polio vaccines as well. But for us to confirm that this was what we were seeing with rotavirus, required for us to have these rotavirus vaccines evaluated in low-income countries in Africa and in Asia. This was done about 10 years ago, and the data clearly demonstrated that vaccines were not performing, at least in terms of point estimates of vaccine efficacy, as well as they were in high-income countries. Now, this was true for both the monovalent vaccines as well as the multivalent vaccines. Both vaccines gave broad protection, but the level of protection varied by the setting. There were also studies that showed differing effects on the duration of protection between high-income and low-income countries and in certain subpopulations, and we'll review some of that information. Now, when you see lower efficacy in developing countries, what does this really mean? And here is a comparison of Bangladesh and Vietnam and Malawi and South Africa. In Bangladesh, the vaccine Rotarix in this case had a vaccine efficacy of 46%, whereas in Vietnam it was 72%. But if you look at the background incidence of rotavirus diarrhea, then the incidence was much higher in Bangladesh at 9.1 per 100 child years of follow-up. which meant that a 46% vaccine efficacy resulted in 4.1 episodes of severe rotavirus gastroenteritis being prevented. In Vietnam, where the vaccine efficacy was 72%, the fact that the incidence was much lower meant that 72% vaccine efficacy translated to only 2 episodes being prevented per 100 child years of observation. So even though there was a greater than 20% reduction in vaccine efficacy in Bangladesh, actually double the number of rotavirus episodes were being prevented by vaccination. Similar findings were seen in Malawi and South Africa, where the estimate of vaccine efficacy was much higher in South Africa, but the number of episodes of severe rotavirus gastroenteritis that were prevented were much greater in Malawi because the background incidence of disease was much greater in Malawi, therefore demonstrating that the vaccine was resulting in greater public health benefit even with a lower efficacy. Now, you look at vaccines to prevent deaths, to prevent hospitalizations, to prevent disease in the community. And the first data that we had on the prevention of mortality by rotavirus vaccination came from Mexico. In Mexico, the vaccine was introduced countrywide in 2007, and shown here in blue and red is the deaths that occurred due to all-cause diarrhea, not rotavirus diarrhea, in blue for infants and in red for toddlers. And what you see here is that as soon as the vaccine was introduced for infants, you saw a dramatic reduction in all-cause diarrheal deaths among infants. And this also extended to older children in the second year when children had received the rotavirus vaccine. So there was a reduction of about 50% of all diarrheal deaths that was seen, and that this continued to be sustained. So rotavirus vaccination can reduce all-cause diarrheal deaths in a country. Now, if we look at countries overall, there have been many studies that have now been done on rotavirus vaccine effectiveness. And there are, of course, many ways of looking to see how the vaccine is working. So this is the most recent data from a systematic review that looks at what happened in hospitalized children before vaccines were introduced and then after vaccines were introduced. And here the panels show children under 5 years of age and then children divided up into infants, toddlers, and 24 to 59 months. Overall, what the data show from 105 articles from 49 countries is that if you look at children who are hospitalized with gastroenteritis, prior to vaccine introduction, about 40% of all samples were rotavirus positive. And after the vaccine was introduced, then that reduced by about 50% to 20%. And this reduction in rotavirus positivity has been sustained over time. Now, if we look at what happened in terms of rotavirus hospitalizations, in terms of hospitalizations for gastroenteritis and for gastroenteritis deaths, then whether we look at infants or we look at children under 5 years of age, in the global assessment done by Burnett et al., there was a reduction of about 60% in rotavirus hospitalizations and about a 36% reduction in diarrheal hospitalizations and in diarrheal mortality, showing that vaccines really are working. When we look to see whether there are data from Asian countries, there are data that were published very early on in the high-income countries from Taiwan, Israel, and Korea that demonstrated vaccine effectiveness that was comparable to high-income countries in Europe, Australia, and the Americas. But in the non-high-income Asian countries, there are two studies that have been published, one from Thailand and one from Bangladesh. And both of these studies show that there is vaccine effectiveness higher in Thailand and lower in Bangladesh. And herd protection was seen where you have protection of groups that did not receive the vaccine. Herd protection was seen in Thailand but was not seen in Bangladesh. So that raises the question whether vaccine effectiveness needs to be above a certain level for us to be able to see indirect protection in the form of herd protection as well. Now, in all of these vaccine effectiveness studies, there were also some very interesting findings when vaccines started to be used in the real world. In Malawi, as I had shown you, in the vaccine efficacy studies, the vaccine had about 50% efficacy. But in effectiveness studies, when the vaccine started to be used in the national program, the vaccine efficacy point, effectiveness point estimate wound up being higher than the vaccine efficacy point estimate. It was about 60% as opposed to the 50% that had been seen in the phase 3 trials. But when children were followed up over time and categorized by subgroups, a couple of interesting findings came out. And essentially, those were that if you had children who were HIV exposed or children who were chronically malnourished, then you had practically no vaccine effectiveness at all. In children who were HIV unexposed or children who were well nourished in the same locations, the vaccines did protect and protected very well, 60% and 78% as shown here. Now, these data were published a few years ago. More recently, in the last month, we have had another systematic review looking at rotavirus vaccines and malnutrition, and there are 7 studies on vaccine effectiveness where malnutrition has been studied. And among well-nourished children, the vaccine effectiveness point estimates in observational studies were 71 to 84% and 26 to 61% in clinical trials. If we look at malnourished children, however, the vaccine effectiveness was much lower, 28 to 45% for observational studies and -3 to 61% for clinical trials. Basically, there is a reduction in children who are malnourished, and this raises the question about whether we should be thinking about either using a vaccine that is not given by the oral route, or whether there is value in giving specifically malnourished children a booster dose of vaccination. Now, if we look at the first licensed rotavirus vaccine, as I mentioned, this was a vaccine that resulted in cases of intussusception in the first week following the first dose of the vaccine, and this vaccine was withdrawn less than a year after it had been licensed. So what do we know about what's happening with vaccine-associated intussusception in different parts of the world? There are early data that came out from Mexico and from Australia that demonstrated that if you had a baseline rate of intussusception, and the data shown here are from Mexico, where the blue bar represents the baseline rate of intussusception of about 90 per 100,000 children. And once rotavirus vaccination was introduced, the red block on top of the blue, which is 3 to 4 more intussusceptions per 100,000 children, were added. So intussusceptions, as had been seen with RotaShield, peaked following the first dose, which makes it much easier to be able to monitor these adverse events following immunization. Similar data was seen from Australia, the United States, have been described now from Europe. But in Africa, when studies began to be done, it was demonstrated that in Africa, there was no evidence of risk that was seen. Whether it was following dose 1 or dose 2, in any window, there was no increased intussusception, no clustering of intussusception in the first week following the first dose. In India, which is one of the largest countries to introduce rotavirus vaccination, the vaccine was introduced in 2016, and by September 2019 was being used all over the country. With a birth cohort of 26 million, this offered an opportunity to also start to study the effectiveness of the vaccines that are being used in India. These studies are ongoing for both Rotavac, the first vaccine to be introduced, and Rotasil, which is the second vaccine that was introduced in India. We've been doing this impact assessment in multiple locations across the country using a test negative design, but there are early data that I'm sharing with you which shows that the picture is very similar to what has been seen in other parts of the world. Overall, rotavirus positivity declines as vaccine coverage increases, and the number of rotavirus positives also, or the number of children admitted with diarrhea also declines. Looking at intussusception in children, so far we have gathered data with the Rotavac vaccine, where we had children with almost 1,000 children with intussusception. And much like the data that was seen in Africa, we saw no clustering after doses 1, 2, or 3 that indicate that there does not appear to be a risk in any interval following any of the doses of the Rotavac vaccine. So to summarize, rotavirus vaccines are now in use in more than half the countries in the world. Where they have been introduced, impact has been measurable. We now have some data on subgroups showing that some children may require more protection, and we need to think about different strategies for them. But there are still outstanding data, whether we will see herd effects in low-income countries, why protection from oral vaccines is lower in low-income countries. We still don't have a correlate of protection, and we need to understand whether new non-living vaccines might have better performance characteristics for low-income countries. So to summarize, the rotavirus vaccine rollout is ongoing. We've done a lot, but we have plenty more to do. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kang, for an insightful lecture. I think there are no questions in the chat so far, so I will take the liberty to ask my own questions. You mentioned that the vaccine efficacy for low and middle income countries was lower compared to the developed countries, and you suggested that there may possibly be a need for a booster for malnourished children. Could you please further comment on this?
Thank you very much for that question. We've been trying to understand for a while why oral vaccines don't perform very well in low-income countries. And there are several reasons that have been proposed, mostly related to infection and inflammation in the gut, because children in low-income settings are exposed to pathogens very early in life and have very high rates of inflammation in their guts. However, when we have done clinical trials trying to reduce infections by giving antibiotics or by studying the microbiome or by reducing inflammation in the gut, those interventions have not worked very well in a clinical trial setting. So I think what we're going to need really is to have some integrated approaches that try to reduce what happens in terms of infections in young children, and that requires a radical change in living conditions.
Thank you for your answer. So I have another question. So in Singapore, the Rotavirus or Rotatech is available by the private market, and there are some patients who are slow to sign up for the vaccine. And by right, 2 doses should be completed by 6 months for the Rotavirus. What do you suggest for patients who are slow to come in for the vaccination? Do you allow them to get a delayed vaccination? Over.
Thank you for that question. Actually, WHO has done an analysis that indicates that removal of the age limit on the rotavirus vaccine will not result in overall harm to children. That it is not that, the reason for placing that limit in the first place was because there was an overlap between the age of vaccination and the age at which intussusception naturally increases in children, which is in the second year of life. But WHO's analysis seems to indicate that removal of that age limit will do no harm. The problem, of course, is that this would require a labeling change on the part of the manufacturers, and the manufacturers are very reluctant to do that.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers.